The meeting lasted 11 minutes. That was how long it took Spencer Holt to tell Althea Gaines, in front of 6 members of the board and a consultant she had never met, that her services were no longer required in an operational capacity at NovaBridge Technology, the company she had founded in the living room of a Baltimore row house 17 years earlier with $3,200 and a laptop she'd bought secondhand from a pawn shop on Greenmount Avenue. He used words like realignment and visionary transition. He thanked her for her foundational contributions. He assured her that her equity position would remain intact and that she would receive a generous consulting arrangement, details to be worked out by legal within the week. He said all of this in the tone of a man delivering good news, leaning forward in his chair with his jacket buttoned and his cufflinks catching the light. Althea did not say a word. She sat at the far end of the conference table, both hands flat on its surface, and she looked at Spencer Holt the way a person looks at weather, acknowledging what is coming without any particular opinion about whether it should. When he finished speaking, she reached for the badge clipped to her lanyard, unclipped it without hurrying, and set it on the table in front of her with a sound so quiet. No one in the room was entirely sure they had heard it. Then she stood, nodded once at the 2 board members she had known the longest, and walked out through the glass doors. Nobody said anything for a full 30 seconds after she left. The consultant glanced at his notes. Spencer straightened his already straight tie. One of the board members, a woman named Joanna Priestley, who had been with NovaBridge since the 2nd year, stared at the badge on the table as though it had said something she did not want to repeat aloud. Spencer had told the board that NovaBridge needed to stop running like a startup and start running like the enterprise it had become. He had been brought in 8 months earlier from a firm that had successfully restructured 3 other mid-sized tech companies, and he wore that record like a second set of credentials, alongside the Columbia MBA and the consulting history and the advisory board memberships that padded his biography. In those 8 months, he had spent a great deal of time reviewing dashboards. He had read performance reports, user growth charts, revenue forecasts. He had met with the engineering leads and the product directors and the heads of sales. He had not spent any meaningful time with Althea, whom he had classified early on as brilliant in a historical sense. Someone whose original contribution was indisputable, but whose thinking had become too attached to how things had always been done to see clearly what they needed to become. He had found a team to replace her. 7 engineers recruited from Carnegie Mellon, Johns Hopkins, and the University of Michigan, each one carrying credentials that looked exceptional on a spreadsheet. He had announced their arrival at a full company meeting, standing at the front of the room, and describing the new technical direction with the confidence of someone who had never been wrong about anything he believed he understood. What Spencer Holt did not understand, had not taken the time to understand, was what Althea Gaines had actually built inside NovaBridge's core platform. The company's primary product was a real-time water quality monitoring system used by municipal utilities across 14 states. It processed sensor data from treatment facilities, flagged anomalies, and triggered automated alerts when contamination thresholds were approached. 3 million people in cities from Cincinnati to Tulsa relied on it, including the residents of Mineral Springs, Arkansas, where a failing water authority had switched to NovaBridge's platform after a contamination crisis 6 years earlier that had put 90 families in the hospital. At the center of the system was a proprietary data reconciliation engine that Althea had written herself over the course of 18 months, mostly at night, mostly alone, pulling double shifts in the early years when NovaBridge still operated out of a converted warehouse in East Baltimore. She had written it to solve a problem no off-the-shelf solution had addressed: the tendency of cheap municipal sensors to produce conflicting readings during temperature swings, creating false positives that overwhelmed utility operators and caused them to start ignoring alerts altogether. Her engine learned each sensor's individual drift patterns and adjusted accordingly, treating each data source as a living thing with its own personality and history. She had never formally documented the reconciliation logic. There was no clean technical specification, no commented codebase, no whiteboard diagram capturing the full architecture. It existed in her head the way a song exists in the head of the person who composed it, and no amount of reverse engineering had ever produced a complete reconstruction. The new team discovered this 9 days after Althea left. They had been tasked with rebuilding the platform on modern cloud infrastructure, a reasonable undertaking that Spencer had presented as the logical evolution of the company's technical foundation. What they encountered instead was a labyrinth. The reconciliation engine was woven through every layer of the system in ways that defied conventional architectural logic. It pulled from 12 different data streams, applied calculations that referenced internal thresholds documented nowhere, and periodically made corrections based on patterns the engineers could observe but not explain. When they attempted to migrate the first cluster of cities to the updated infrastructure, the reconciliation engine failed silently. It did not crash. It produced no error messages. It simply stopped correcting, and the system began generating the same flood of conflicting alerts that had paralyzed utilities before Althea's solution had existed in the first place. 3 control room operators in separate cities called NovaBridge's support line within the same hour, describing the same problem in different words. The system was crying wolf again, and they were starting to tune it out. Spencer received the first call on a Thursday evening. By Friday morning, he had convened the 7 engineers and asked for a timeline on resolution. The youngest of them, a 26-year-old with a master's from Michigan who had been lead architect on the migration, told Spencer the situation was more complex than anticipated. Spencer nodded and asked again about the timeline. The young engineer said he needed more time to understand what he was dealing with. Spencer's jaw tightened, and he said that time was exactly what they did not have. By the following Wednesday, the team had produced 12 separate analyses and resolved nothing. They had found portions of the reconciliation engine's code, but could not trace the full logic chain. It was like finding individual paragraphs of a novel scattered through different rooms, and trying to reconstruct the plot without knowing how many rooms remained unexamined. They brought in 2 outside consultants at considerable expense. The consultants reviewed what the team had found and agreed that the original architecture was elegant in a way that made it almost impossible to deconstruct from the outside. One of the consultants said, quietly and not for attribution, that whoever had built the original system had possessed a genuinely rare kind of engineering intelligence, the kind that couldn't be simulated or summarized. Spencer did not pass that observation along to the board. On the 11th night, one of the migration team engineers, a quiet woman in her 30s named Helene, who had said very little in the group meetings and observed a great deal, found something in the company's archived source code repository, a folder, unlabeled, created 17 years earlier under a login that had since been retired. Inside were 340 files of handwritten notes, scanned pages, barely legible, dense with equations and margin comments written in a small, precise hand. Some were dated. They tracked the development of the reconciliation logic across 18 months of iteration, written in the kind of shorthand that suggested they had never been intended for anyone else's eyes. Helene brought the archive to Spencer the following morning and set her laptop on his desk without a word. He looked at the scanned pages for several minutes before asking, almost to himself, where Althea Gaines was now. Nobody had kept in regular contact since her departure. Her official company email had been deactivated. Her assistant had been reassigned. It took the HR department 2 days of phone calls and a conversation with NovaBridge's original co-founder, a man named Gregory Bates, who had left the company 12 years earlier and still talked to Althea every few months, to learn that she had moved back to Baltimore. She was spending most of her time volunteering with a nonprofit that helped low-income rural communities build and maintain their own water quality monitoring systems using sensors that cost less than $40 each. Spencer drove to Baltimore himself. He parked outside a converted elementary school building in East Baltimore that the nonprofit used as its workspace and walked through a front door propped open with a cinder block. Inside, at a long folding table covered in small circuit boards and printed wiring diagrams, he found Althea exactly as he had never allowed himself to picture her. Completely at ease. A magnifying headset pushed up on her forehead, explaining something to a young man who looked about 19, her voice carrying the patience of someone who had explained the same thing 100 times and found it worth explaining again. She looked up when he came in. She did not appear surprised. She set down the soldering iron she had been holding and waited. He told her the platform was failing. He told her 3 million people were depending on a system that her replacement team could not stabilize. He told her about the archive Helene had found, about 11 nights of dead ends, about board members calling at midnight. He told her that the company needed her back. She said no. The word was quiet and clear, not angry, not satisfied, just final. He asked her why. She was quiet for a moment, then told him something he had not known, had never thought to ask about, something that existed nowhere in any file he had ever reviewed. 14 years earlier, a month before NovaBridge closed its Series A funding, the reconciliation engine had nearly been shelved entirely. The lead investor had brought in an outside engineering firm to evaluate the platform, and the firm's report had described the reconciliation approach as unorthodox and poorly documented, recommending the company rebuild on a more conventional framework. Althea had spent 6 weeks preparing a counter-presentation, documenting her methodology in enough detail to satisfy the evaluators and demonstrating in live tests that her approach outperformed the alternative by every metric that mattered. She had saved the platform. She had saved the funding round. 3 weeks later, the lead investor had filed for a patent on a novel water sensor data reconciliation methodology under the firm's corporate name. Incorporating the technical documentation, Althea had prepared for the counter-presentation. She had never been named as an inventor. She had never received compensation beyond her existing equity. When she had raised the issue with the company's legal team at the time, she had been told, gently, carefully, by a lawyer who seemed genuinely uncomfortable, that the patent filing was a business decision above her level. She had gone back to her desk. She had continued building the system because the system was what mattered to her. Because 3 million people who didn't know her name would eventually depend on it working correctly. And that had always been enough. Spencer sat down on the edge of the folding table without asking permission. He said nothing for a long time. The young man Althea had been working with excused himself and stepped outside. Through the school's original windows, still covered in old paint, the sounds of the street came in faintly. He came back 2 more times over the following week, each visit a little less certain than the last, each conversation longer. He offered her money the first time and a title the second time. She turned both down with the same even patience. On the third visit, he asked her plainly what it would take. She told him. She wanted every engineer at NovaBridge, regardless of how they had entered the company, whether through trade school, community college, or a decade of self-teaching in a room with bad insulation, to be evaluated and compensated on the same scale as those who had arrived with graduate degrees. She wanted the platform to carry a public acknowledgement of its original authorship, and she wanted the patent dispute submitted to independent arbitration within 60 days, in writing. Spencer agreed to all 3. When Althea walked back through the glass doors of NovaBridge, the engineering floor went still in the particular way of a room that has been waiting for something without fully admitting it. Engineers mid-conversation trailed off. People staring at monitors looked up. The 7-person migration team clustered around a whiteboard at the far end of the floor, covered in diagrams. None of them had managed to reconcile. Went quiet. She didn't address anyone. She moved to an open workstation, sat down, and opened a terminal. What followed lasted 45 seconds. She typed a command no one in the room recognized, a diagnostic script she had written 10 years earlier that had never been in any official documentation, because she had built it for her own use during a stretch when she had been the only person who knew the system well enough to need it. She read the output for roughly 30 seconds, her eyes moving without urgency across the screen. Then she navigated to a configuration file the migration team had examined multiple times without finding significant, and changed a single value in a block of parameters governing how the reconciliation engine weighted sensor readings during temperature variance events. She changed it from 847 to 523. It was a number that had come from 18 months of her own observational data, tested against real-world conditions across a dozen facilities over 3 winters. It existed nowhere in any document. It lived only in her memory, the way useful things live when the person who learned them never expected to have to explain them to someone else. She pressed enter. 11 seconds later, every monitoring dashboard in the room updated simultaneously. The false alert flood stopped. Sensor readings from 32 facilities across 4 states aligned into clean, accurate streams. No one moved. The young engineer from Michigan, who had not slept more than 4 hours in any of the past 11 nights, sat at his desk with both hands still on his keyboard and stared at the screen in front of him. He had spent weeks trying to understand a system she had corrected from memory in under a minute. He was not embarrassed by this, in the way he might have expected. He was something closer to humbled, quietly, genuinely, in a way that felt different from any other time he had encountered a problem he couldn't solve. Spencer stood at the glass wall of his office above the floor. He watched Althea push her chair back from the workstation and stand, unhurried, the way she had sat down. He had run companies before. He had overseen technical transformations and made decisions about people's professional worth, based on information he now understood to be radically incomplete. He stood there watching a woman who had built something irreplaceable from nothing, who had been stripped of its authorship, who had been shown the door by a man holding a Columbia degree, and who had just fixed in 45 seconds what 7 credentialed engineers had failed to fix in 11 days. And he understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that no classroom had ever taught him what he had just learned standing at that window. He called a full company meeting for the following morning. He stood at the front of the room, without notes, and without the practiced confidence that had characterized every previous all-hands he had run at NovaBridge. He told the room that he had made a serious error in judgment, not a strategic miscalculation, not a misaligned initiative, but a human error, the kind that came from believing that a piece of paper could tell you what a person knew. He told them that the institutional knowledge inside the company's walls had nearly been lost because he had never thought to ask the person who held it what she had actually built. He described what had happened on the floor the previous afternoon in plain language, without softening it or attaching qualifications designed to protect his own comfort. He said the company was going to change, and he spent the next 30 minutes describing specifically how. In the weeks that followed, the 7 migration engineers did something that surprised most of the company. Rather than distancing themselves from what had happened, they asked Althea to teach them. They sat with her one at a time, and sometimes in small groups, not in formal sessions, but in the way people learn things they actually want to know, by watching, asking, and paying attention without an agenda. She accepted without ceremony. She was not generous with praise, but she was patient with questions, and she had a way of explaining complex systems through examples drawn from real failures she had encountered that made the abstract concrete in ways formal education rarely achieved. The reconciliation engine was eventually documented, fully and accurately, with Althea listed as primary author. The patent dispute went to arbitration. The company's engineer classification system was overhauled, and within the year, 4 people who had entered NovaBridge through non-traditional paths were reclassified with pay adjustments that, in one case, represented a 31% increase. Althea returned to the work she had always done, the unglamorous, granular, deeply necessary work of keeping a system honest. She continued making trips to the East Baltimore nonprofit on weekends, sometimes bringing younger NovaBridge engineers with her, because she believed that understanding what the system was actually for the communities at the end of the data, the families who couldn't afford a water crisis, was not optional background knowledge, but the most important thing any of them could carry. Spencer Holt became a less certain man after that year, which made him a more effective one. He asked more questions than he answered. He spent more time on the engineering floor and less time watching it from above. He evaluated people differently, not by abandoning credentials, but by understanding that credentials were a starting point, not a measurement. He kept a handwritten note taped inside his desk drawer where no one else would see it. It said, 8:47 to 5:23. Ask the question before you close the file. He read it every morning before opening his laptop, not as penance, but as a reminder of what genuine competence looked like when it had no reason left to perform for anyone at all.